They thought I was invisible because I sat at the front desk answering phones and greeting visitors. For 3 years, I smiled politely while executives walked past me like I was furniture, made inappropriate comments thinking I couldn't hear them, and discussed confidential business matters as if the receptionist was too stupid to understand what they were saying. But what CEO Marcus Blackwood and his corrupt leadership team didn't know was that I had been recording every conversation, documenting every illegal decision, and building a case that would destroy their entire $800 million empire. Watch until the end because you won't believe how one receptionist with perfect access brought down a corporate criminal organization and walked away with a $10 million whistleblower reward. My name is Rachel Chin, and this is how I went from the front desk to becoming the most dangerous person in the building. The front desk reality. TechVision Industries was a telecommunications company that provided internet and phone services to millions of customers across 15 states, and I started working there in 2020 as a receptionist, making $38,000 annually. My job was to sit at the massive front desk in the corporate headquarters lobby, answer incoming calls, greet visitors, manage the executive calendar system, and basically be the first point of contact for anyone entering the building. Most people assumed being a receptionist required no real skills beyond being pleasant and organized, but the reality was that I saw and heard absolutely everything that happened in that company, because executives treated the front desk area like it was a neutral zone where they could speak freely. I had access to the master calendar system that showed every meeting happening in the building. I could see who was visiting and why. I overheard phone conversations when executives took calls while walking through the lobby. And I was present for countless discussions that people had right in front of me, assuming I wasn't paying attention or couldn't understand business terminology. The executives at TechVision were particularly careless about what they said around me because CEO Marcus Blackwood had created a culture where support staff were considered completely irrelevant and beneath the notice of important people. The CEO's contempt. Marcus Blackwood was 58 years old, had founded TechVision Industries 30 years earlier, and had built it from a small regional provider into an $800 million publicly traded corporation. He was also one of the most arrogant and unethical people I had ever encountered in my life. Marcus would walk through the lobby multiple times daily and would never once acknowledge my existence or respond when I greeted him professionally. He treated all support staff with visible contempt and would snap his fingers at assistants to get their attention or raise his voice when things weren't done exactly to his specifications. I watched Marcus berate a young administrative assistant to tears because she had used the wrong font size on a presentation, and he screamed at a security guard for not opening the door fast enough when he was carrying coffee. His behavior set the tone for the entire executive culture, where treating lower-level employees badly was seen as acceptable and even expected from leaders. The worst part was listening to Marcus make crude comments about female employees when he thought nobody important was listening. He would rate women's appearances on a scale of 1 to 10 with his fellow executives, make explicit sexual comments about which employees he found attractive, and joke about hiring practices that prioritized looks over qualifications for certain positions. The illegal practices discovery. About 6 months into working at TechVision, I started noticing patterns in executive behavior and conversations that suggested something seriously wrong was happening beyond just toxic workplace culture. Marcus and other senior leaders would have urgent whispered conversations in the lobby about regulatory filings and customer complaints that needed to be handled carefully to avoid government scrutiny. I heard multiple references to dealing with state attorneys general who were investigating consumer protection violations and discussions about how to minimize bad publicity from customer lawsuits. One morning, I overheard Patricia Morrison tell Marcus that they needed to be more careful about how they documented certain billing practices because federal regulators were asking questions about unauthorized charges appearing on customer accounts. Marcus responded by saying they should just make sure the documentation looked legitimate and that customers were too stupid to understand their own bills anyway, so the complaints would eventually die down. That conversation made me start paying much closer attention to what executives were discussing, and I began to realize that TechVision was systematically defrauding customers through hidden fees and unauthorized charges. The recording system. I decided to start documenting what I was witnessing, but I knew that taking notes or obviously recording conversations would be noticed and would get me fired immediately. Instead, I developed a subtle system using my personal phone, which I kept on my desk as if I was just checking messages during slow periods. I discovered that my phone could record audio continuously while appearing to be inactive, and I started recording every conversation that happened within earshot of the front desk. The lobby acoustics were actually perfect for this because sound carried clearly from the seating areas, where executives often had impromptu meetings, and from the elevator banks, where people talked while waiting. Over the following months, I accumulated hundreds of hours of recordings, capturing executives discussing fraudulent billing practices, strategies for avoiding regulatory enforcement, plans to destroy evidence of wrongdoing, and explicitly illegal instructions about how to handle customer complaints and government inquiries. I backed up all the recordings to encrypted cloud storage accounts and kept detailed logs of dates, times, participants, and topics discussed so I could find specific conversations quickly if needed. The billing fraud scheme. The recordings revealed that TechVision had been systematically adding unauthorized charges to customer bills for years as a way to boost revenue without customers noticing. The scheme involved adding small monthly fees with vague descriptions like network enhancement fee or service optimization charge, which most customers would assume were legitimate parts of their service plans. The amounts were usually between $3 and $8 per month, which seemed insignificant individually, but generated over $40 million annually when applied to millions of customer accounts. Executives explicitly discussed how the fees were designed to be confusing and difficult for customers to understand or dispute. In one recorded conversation, Marcus told his executive team that the key to the strategy was making sure the unauthorized charges appeared on bills using technical language that sounded official and justified. He said that even if customers called to complain, the customer service representatives were trained to explain the fees in ways that made them seem mandatory or unavoidable, rather than admitting they were fraudulent charges that could be removed. Multiple recordings captured executives laughing about how easy it was to steal from customers and expressing amazement that they had been running the scheme for over 5 years without serious consequences. The regulatory cover-up. Even more damning than the billing fraud itself were the recordings that documented how TechVision was actively obstructing regulatory investigations and destroying evidence to avoid accountability. State consumer protection agencies and the Federal Communications Commission had opened multiple investigations into customer complaints about unauthorized charges, but TechVision was providing false information and incomplete records in response to official inquiries. I recorded conversations where Marcus and General Counsel David Park discussed strategies for responding to regulatory subpoenas in ways that would technically comply with legal requirements while hiding the most incriminating evidence. David explained that they should provide massive amounts of irrelevant documents to bury investigators in paperwork, while claiming that certain key documents had been lost or destroyed in routine data purges. Marcus approved this obstruction strategy and told David to make sure that any employees who might have knowledge of the fraud were instructed not to cooperate with investigators beyond providing the minimum information required by law. I also recorded discussions about paying settlements to state agencies to make investigations go away without admitting wrongdoing or agreeing to stop the fraudulent practices. The employee intimidation. As I continued recording executive conversations, I discovered that TechVision had a systematic approach to silencing employees who tried to report problems or raise concerns about illegal practices. Multiple executives discussed strategies for identifying potential whistleblowers and either buying their silence or destroying their credibility before they could report to authorities. In one particularly disturbing recording, Marcus told his HR director to create documentation showing performance problems for an employee who had threatened to report billing irregularities to state regulators. The HR director asked whether they had legitimate grounds for terminating the employee, and Marcus said it didn't matter because they could always manufacture reasons after the fact, and the employee would be too afraid of retaliation to follow through on reporting. I heard similar conversations about other employees who had raised concerns and who were subsequently fired or forced to sign settlements that included non-disclosure agreements, preventing them from discussing what they knew. The culture of fear was so intense that most employees who noticed problems would stay silent rather than risk losing their jobs and being blacklisted in the telecommunications industry. The personal harassment.
While I was secretly documenting TechVision's corporate crimes, I was also dealing with increasingly inappropriate behavior from male executives who seemed to think that being a receptionist meant I was available for harassment. CFO Patricia Morrison's husband, who was VP of operations, would make uncomfortable comments about my appearance almost daily and would find excuses to lean over my desk in ways that invaded my personal space. He told me multiple times that I was too pretty to be wasting my potential at a front desk, and that if I was nicer to him, he could help me get promoted to a better position. When I politely deflected these advances, he became hostile and started complaining to other executives that I was unfriendly and unprofessional. Another executive started sending me inappropriate text messages after hours, including photos I definitely did not want to receive and requests to meet him privately outside of work. I documented all of this harassment along with the corporate fraud because I knew it showed the toxic culture that allowed illegal behavior to flourish. The executives at TechVision believed they were untouchable and that nobody would take seriously any complaints from a receptionist about their conduct. The whistleblower decision. After 18 months of recording conversations and documenting evidence, I had accumulated an overwhelming case against TechVision's leadership that included proof of systematic customer fraud affecting millions of people, obstruction of justice to avoid regulatory enforcement, witness intimidation and illegal retaliation against employees, and a pattern of harassment and discrimination that violated federal employment laws. I consulted secretly with whistleblower attorneys who specialized in representing employees who report corporate fraud, and they confirmed that my evidence was extraordinarily valuable and that I was protected by federal whistleblower laws from retaliation. They explained that the False Claims Act and other whistleblower statutes provided for substantial financial rewards when individuals report fraud that results in government recovery of stolen money, and that my case could potentially result in rewards worth millions of dollars. The attorneys helped me prepare comprehensive submissions to the Federal Communications Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, multiple state attorneys general, and the Department of Justice, detailing TechVision's fraud and providing summaries of the recorded evidence I had collected. The strategy was to provide enough information to trigger serious investigations while holding back the most damaging recordings as leverage to ensure authorities took the case seriously. The investigations begin. Within 3 weeks of my whistleblower submissions, federal and state authorities had launched coordinated investigations into TechVision's billing practices and regulatory compliance. The company received subpoenas from the FCC, SEC, and attorneys general in 8 states, demanding extensive documentation about billing procedures, customer complaints, regulatory filings, and executive communications. Marcus and other executives initially tried to respond to the investigations using their standard obstruction playbook, but they quickly realized this situation was different because investigators seemed to have inside information about specific fraudulent practices and were asking questions that demonstrated someone had provided detailed evidence. I watched Marcus become increasingly paranoid as he tried to figure out who had reported the company and whether other employees were cooperating with investigators. He held emergency meetings with senior leadership where they discussed their legal exposure and whether they should try to negotiate settlements before criminal charges were filed. The stress was visible on all the executives who had participated in the fraud as they realized their careers and potentially their freedom were at risk. The company meltdown. As the investigations intensified, TechVision's business operations began falling apart because executives were too distracted by legal problems to focus on running the company effectively. Major customers started canceling contracts after learning about the fraud investigations, and negative media coverage was destroying the company's reputation in the telecommunications industry. Stock prices collapsed as investors panicked about potential fines and criminal liability, and several board members resigned rather than be associated with the growing scandal. Employees throughout the company were demoralized, and many talented people started looking for jobs elsewhere because they didn't want to be connected to TechVision when the full extent of the fraud became public. I continued showing up for work as usual and maintained my role as the friendly receptionist while internally celebrating that everything was unfolding exactly as I had hoped. Nobody suspected that the quiet woman at the front desk was the source of all their problems and that I had recordings of their most incriminating conversations safely backed up and ready to be released to prosecutors if needed. The criminal charges. 6 months after my whistleblower submissions, federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against Marcus Blackwood, CFO Patricia Morrison, General Counsel David Park, and 3 other senior executives, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. The indictments detailed how TechVision had stolen over $200 million from customers through unauthorized billing charges and how executives had systematically destroyed evidence and intimidated employees to avoid accountability. Prosecutors held a press conference where they specifically thanked a confidential whistleblower whose evidence had been crucial to building the criminal case. And they emphasized that the investigation would not have been possible without an insider who had documented executive misconduct in extraordinary detail. Marcus and the other executives were arrested in coordinated early morning raids that were designed to maximize publicity and send a message about consequences for corporate fraud. The arrests made front-page news, and TechVision's stock price dropped another 40% as investors realized the company's leadership had been running a criminal enterprise.
The evidence revelation. During pretrial proceedings, my attorneys reached an agreement with prosecutors to provide my recorded conversations as evidence in exchange for protecting my identity and ensuring my safety from potential retaliation. When defense attorneys heard the recordings for the first time, they were shocked by how comprehensively I had documented every aspect of the fraud and how clearly the executives had discussed their illegal activities. Marcus's attorney tried to argue that the recordings were inadmissible because I hadn't obtained consent to record conversations, but prosecutors countered that the recordings were made in a public workplace area where there was no reasonable expectation of privacy and that whistleblower protections allowed me to document evidence of criminal activity. The judge ruled that the recordings were admissible and they became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against TechVision's leadership. Media coverage of the recordings included quotes from some of the most damaging conversations, including Marcus joking about stealing from customers and executives discussing how to destroy evidence and intimidate potential witnesses. The plea agreements. Faced with overwhelming evidence from my recordings and the prospect of decades in federal prison if convicted at trial, all 6 defendants eventually agreed to plea bargains that included substantial prison sentences and cooperation with ongoing investigations. Marcus Blackwood pleaded guilty to fraud and obstruction charges and was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, plus forfeiture of $80 million in personal assets and permanent banishment from serving as an officer or director of any public company. CFO Patricia Morrison received 9 years in prison, and General Counsel David Park got 7 years, plus disbarment from practicing law. The other 3 executives received sentences ranging from 4 to 6 years, depending on their level of involvement in the fraud scheme. All the defendants were also required to cooperate with civil lawsuits filed by state attorneys general seeking restitution for defrauded customers and with SEC enforcement actions seeking disgorgement of fraudulent profits. The plea agreements included statements where defendants acknowledged their criminal conduct and accepted responsibility for the harm they had caused to millions of customers. The whistleblower reward. The most satisfying outcome of exposing TechVision's fraud was receiving a whistleblower reward of $10 million from the SEC and additional payments from state agencies that had recovered money from the company. The SEC reward was calculated as a percentage of the penalties and disgorgement that TechVision was required to pay as a result of my report and the evidence I had provided to investigators.
My attorneys explained that this was one of the largest individual whistleblower rewards ever paid and reflected the exceptional quality and comprehensiveness of the documentation I had created over 18 months of recording executive conversations. The money was life-changing for someone who had been earning $38,000 as a receptionist, and it allowed me to pay off my student loans, buy a house, invest for retirement, and fund my education to transition into a new career. More important than the money was the knowledge that I had helped recover hundreds of millions of dollars for defrauded customers and had held powerful executives accountable for their crimes. The personal vindication. Beyond the financial reward, the most meaningful aspect of the TechVision case was the personal vindication of proving that someone executives had dismissed as irrelevant had destroyed their criminal enterprise. Marcus Blackwood had walked past my desk thousands of times over 3 years without ever acknowledging my existence because he assumed a receptionist was too unimportant to matter. He and his fellow executives had discussed their fraud and corruption openly in front of me because they believed I was too stupid to understand or too powerless to do anything about what I was witnessing. Their arrogance and contempt for support staff had led them to expose their own crimes to the one person who had perfect access to document everything. Multiple media outlets interviewed me after my identity as the whistleblower became public, and I explained that executives should remember that the people they ignore and dismiss often see and hear everything, and that treating employees with respect isn't just ethical, but also practical self-interest. I became a symbol for other administrative and support staff who had witnessed misconduct but had been afraid to report it. Federal authorities credited the TechVision case with triggering a wave of whistleblower reports that led to major enforcement actions across multiple industries. The new career. With my whistleblower reward and newfound public profile, I was able to transition into work as a corporate compliance consultant and whistleblower advocate, helping companies improve their ethics programs and supporting employees who witness misconduct. I completed certifications in compliance and corporate governance and started speaking at conferences about the importance of creating cultures where employees at all levels feel empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Several companies hired me to review their internal controls and whistleblower procedures and to train employees about recognizing and reporting fraud. I also worked with whistleblower advocacy organizations to support other individuals who were considering reporting corporate misconduct and who needed guidance about how to document evidence and protect themselves from retaliation. The work was meaningful because I could use my experience to help prevent fraud and to encourage other people to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. The final message. The TechVision case proves that power dynamics in corporate environments are more fragile than executives realize, and that the people they dismiss as irrelevant often have more influence than anyone imagines. Marcus Blackwood and his leadership team believed they were untouchable because of their wealth and positions, but they underestimated the receptionist who was quietly documenting their crimes. Their arrogance led them to discuss fraud and obstruction openly in front of someone they considered too unimportant to matter, and that fatal mistake destroyed their careers and sent them to prison. My story demonstrates that whistleblowers can come from anywhere in an organization, and that having access to information is more valuable than having traditional authority or status. The executives who walked past my desk without acknowledgement learned too late that the person they ignored was the most dangerous enemy they could have. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, and the people everyone underestimates turn out to be the ones who change everything.